So, I'm not exactly sure if this is a skinwalker thing or if this is something else entirely. But first, a little bit of background on me. I and my brother live with my dying grandfather, who is just far too sick to be by himself, which is why him and I are staying with him to take care of him. My grandfather lives kind of out and about, in the middle of nowhere, near Ute reservations in Colorado. Around his property, there's lots of space to hike, hang out, and go ATVing. My brother and I's father passed away when we were both very young. We're only 3 years apart, and he died when he was 5, and I was only 2. I don't have much memory of him. In fact, he was kind of an alcoholic and was in and out of our lives, so my brother doesn't retain much memory either, other than a few old photographs here and there. Luckily for us, our grandfather stepped in and has raised us ever since, and he has been more of a father figure than my real dad could have ever been, which is why we opted to stay and take care of him while he's been deathly sick. With my career, I can work anywhere as long as I have a laptop and an internet connection, and my brother is out of work at the moment, so I'm kind of supporting us 3, just until my grandfather gets better. Enough about us. Now onto what we suspect is a skinwalker around the house and the area. A couple of days ago, my brother was ATVing not too far away from the house, and said he spotted a tall hooded figure, or what appeared to be hooded, with what appeared to be antlers, or maybe some sort of ancient headdress, like an old chief would wear, or somebody who was into magic in the native culture. I know there's a Ute reservation not more than 50 miles away from here, so I don't know if that has anything at all to do with this. But it gets even stranger. About 2 or 3 weeks before Christmas this last year, we would always hear strange sounds outside the house. There's really no neighbors around, and in Colorado, at least in the area we are, we don't really get much snow, which is nice. But that doesn't mean the Colorado winters aren't safe. We've had some pretty extreme low temperatures, but nothing I don't feel like us 3 can handle. I almost wonder if that has anything to do with what we're seeing. Like, maybe the cold weather is bringing this thing around, since we only started seeing it in the past couple of months. Or, mainly my brother has. I've only seen or heard it a handful of times, mainly just hearing it. Back just before Thanksgiving, this would have been the very first time I had ever heard of anything like it outside the house. My grandfather had spent a few days in the hospital, and no, this was not COVID related. So, me and my brother played house sitter for 3 days until he returned. We would be visiting him frequently to check in on him, make sure he was doing well, and he had everything he needed. But we didn't want to be burdensome and let him get his rest. So we would return, and he could always shoot us a text message anytime he wanted our company, which was fine by me. We spent a lot of time getting fresh air, relaxing, and just doing what we do. Until nighttime. Sometimes, I can't speak for my brother, I didn't like hanging outside at night. I still don't. I kind of get this eerie feeling. Maybe not so much that I'm being watched, but that some sort of dangerous animal is around. I can't quite describe the feeling. Like there's something out in the darkness that's going to get me. So I try and stay inside as soon as sundown begins. Even if it comes to taking out the trash, I try and keep the canisters close to the house for that reason alone. But during those few days in the hospital, I woke up to some really weird noises coming outside the house. It sounded like everything from a wolf, to a hyena, to an elephant, making huge stomping noises, and almost every other animal in between. Except it didn't sound right. It was weird and distorted, as if an animal was like morphing into another and changing, followed by howls and cries of pain. It was one of the most disturbing things I've ever heard in my life, coming from an animal. My brother, of course, didn't hear it, since he sleeps like a rock, and it woke me up out of a dead sleep, and I was far too afraid to actually go check and see what it was. I can't remember if it was the following night, or maybe the night after the next. But then there was tapping on the windows, dragging something sharp and metal along the side of the house that, when I checked, did not leave any markings or any tracks, so I don't know what it could have been. It was high up, maybe 5 or 6 feet off the ground, and where my bedroom is in the house, it's at one of the corners, so the sound was dragging right against my wall on the other side. Something was out there, and whatever it was didn't pass by my window, like it was smart enough to not be seen. If I told other people this, they would probably tell me that somebody is messing with me. The only problem is that there is nobody else around for miles and miles. Remember how I said he doesn't have any neighbors? Well, that's true. I think the nearest person is 5-6 miles away. Yeah, my grandfather's pretty much out there. I'm very fortunate that I at least get cell service, even if it's not the best. It allows me to still remain in contact with the world. Then, the very next day, when my grandfather was brought back to his house, it all just stopped. The weird feelings outside at night, the noises. I don't know what the correlation is, but it's strange. Maybe about 10 or 12 days later, I remember it was right before December started, and my brother and I decided to go on a hike during the day. What we found was also very disturbing. 3 to 4 dead does. Nothing was wrong with them. They looked like they had just dropped dead from where they were standing, and they were all within 5 to 6 feet of each other. My brother and I, thinking it was as strange as can be, took our time to observe the bodies because the manner in which they died, the position they were on the ground at, and the fact that they were all close to each other just didn't really make sense. They weren't lying on their side like you'd expect to see from a deer. They almost appeared to be as if they collapsed on all fours. It's hard to explain. There was no bullet wounds, no puncture marks, and they also appear to have been dead for a little while, maybe a day at most, and even no signs of rigor mortis or anything. They were still very soft. Even though the weather's cold, there still should be some signs of decay setting in. We don't know if this has anything to do with the things that have been happening, but it was only about 1.5 miles away from the house, the same direction my brother recently went ATVing in and saw that humanoid shape, with what he saw was either a headdress or antlers. Anyhow, I figured if anybody could, you out of everybody could debunk these theories, and maybe see if they're real or not. Or maybe somebody truly is messing with us. But why would they make the effort to come all the way out here? And what would the incentive be? We have nothing to offer. My grandfather isn't exactly rich, so there's really nothing they could get from him. Money, items. My brother and I don't have a lot either. That includes money and materials. There's nothing around the property of worth either. No valuables, tools, cars, assets. So I'm not quite sure what the incentive would be, if it truly was a person, and why they would be pursuing this whole thing this long. Or maybe it's possible that this is indeed something supernatural, like a skinwalker, or some other native creature from lore, of which I'm not sure. I thought only Navajo had skinwalkers. Maybe I am wrong. Five years ago, I was living north outside of Sacramento, California, and was very close friends with a couple of natives around that area. Well, one didn't really believe in any of the folklore or legend of his tribe or people, and one night he was driving back home, and he said he saw some sort of wolf-like creature, except it was huge on all fours, and the head, he described it to me as looking like a skull with horns and antlers, kind of like a buck does, but more evil, he said. The horns weren't like that of an antler. They were sharper, more angled, and protruding far more than antlers ever would, in one direction. It was wicked, he said. The thing also had dull yellow eyes, set far back in the skull head that he described. like they were tiny glowing yellow embers set in the black holes of the eye sockets of the skull. It crossed the road, looked over at his car, and then casually walked to the other side. He said he was terrified, and didn't tell me this till about a few weeks after, because here's what happened after he saw this thing that night. He began hearing his name being called outside his window every night, the voice of his dead mother, whom passed back when he was 12 years old, and it's been haunting him ever since. He's told me that he'll be laying in bed some nights, and he'll hear his mother's voice calling him from out of the woods, or from far away, and he looks out his window, and he can't see anything, but he just describes to me this terrible feeling, like he knows if he steps foot outside to follow where the voice is coming from, something really bad is going to happen to him, and he has to resist every time. But he said that it gets worse. There's almost, and these are his words, not mine, that there's almost like a supernatural force drawing him to come toward the voice, like it's pulling him, not just out of curiosity, but there is a force dragging him, making him come towards the forest, and he has to resist every time. He described it to me as being almost like in a trance, where you have no control over your body and your mind, and you just find yourself doing it out of sheer reaction, like your own control is not even valid. This was all going down about mid to late 2016. In 2018, I ended up moving out of state, but kept contact with him and my other friends as well. For the story, I'll call him Sean. Many of my other friends, and it just so happened to be my friend's circle, were also native of the same tribe. They never had any issues, and growing up like I did, they weren't really immersed in their own culture, language, or folklore. Either was Sean, but Sean could not refute what had happened to him. He couldn't dismiss what was going on to him now. The other friends we hung about, which were also almost like cousins because we were all so close, they did not believe him, and he was often laughed at and made fun of, even though many of the supposed elders of the same tribe all had their own tales and stories, but maybe they were just seen as old wives' tales, or spooky stories to scare him. I don't know. I still keep in contact with Sean, and he still tells me that it's happening from time to time, but it's mostly died down, especially since 2020 has hit. While I only know so very little about skinwalkers, I just keep thinking back to what he saw that night, and I almost can't help but wonder if that's what he saw, and now that because he saw this, in a way he must have been marked, which is why it keeps reappearing and coming after him, trying to get him. Of course I could be wrong, and I really don't fully know what I'm talking about, and I'm hoping you could hear my story and verify, or at least read it to your fans, and maybe they can provide more information. Maybe somebody really knowledgeable on skinwalkers, and how they relate to following people, marking people with, a spiritual mark, and going after them. Because I don't know anything about that, but it's a very real possibility at this point. Thank you for reading.